Disclaimer. The following video recounts a personal near-death experience and the insights gained during that event. The story shared reflects the individual's personal beliefs, interpretations, and spiritual journey. While it may resonate with some viewers, it is not intended to promote any particular ideology or replace medical, psychological, or professional advice. Viewer discretion is advised, and we encourage respectful dialogue and open-mindedness as you engage with this content.
Boy returns from death with a terrifying message from heaven. In a quiet Nebraska town, the Burpo family's life was turned upside down when their young son, Colton, nearly lost his life during a medical emergency. What happened next was nothing short of a miracle. As Colton awoke, he began recounting vivid details of an incredible journey beyond the grave. He spoke of heavenly visions, encounters with angels, and even meeting Jesus himself. But it wasn't just a peaceful glimpse of paradise. Colton returned with a message that left his family and everyone who heard it stunned. A message far more unsettling than they ever could have imagined. This is the story of a boy who returned from death with a terrifying message from heaven. A revelation that challenges everything we think we know about life, death, and what might lie beyond. It was a typical spring day in 2003 in Imperial, Nebraska, a small, close-knit town where everyone knew each other. The Burpo family, made up of Todd, Sonia, their young son Colton, and his sister Cassie, were like many families in the area. They lived a modest life, rooted in faith and community. Todd was a pastor at the local church and also worked several other jobs to make ends meet. He was a volunteer firefighter, a coach, and a handyman. Despite the demanding schedule, Todd was a devoted father and husband. Sonia, a schoolteacher, was equally busy, balancing her career with caring for the children. For the Burpos, life was hectic, but filled with love and a strong sense of purpose. Colton, at just 4 years old, was a lively, energetic child. He was curious and playful, always asking questions about everything he encountered. His blonde hair and wide smile made him instantly endearing to everyone he met. He loved spending time with his family, especially tagging along with his father. Todd often brought Colton with him on errands around town, and they had a close bond. It was clear that Colton admired his father, often imitating him and wanting to be just like him. Life was busy, but good for the Burpo family, until a seemingly minor illness began to change everything. In January of that year, Colton came down with a stomach virus that didn't seem unusual at first. He had been sick with a fever and some stomach pain, which Todd and Sonia assumed was just the flu. But as the days went by, Colton didn't get better. His symptoms worsened, and he began to cry out in pain, clutching his stomach. Sonia became increasingly worried, noticing that his cries were different. They were cries of genuine, excruciating pain. It was unlike anything she had ever heard from her normally tough little boy. Todd and Sonia decided to take Colton to the local family doctor, who examined him but couldn't find anything significantly wrong. The doctor thought it was just a severe case of the stomach flu and advised them to keep Colton hydrated and let it run its course. Todd, trying to keep his family calm, reassured Sonia that everything would be fine, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Over the next few days, Colton's condition deteriorated rapidly. His pain became unbearable, and he could barely stand up without screaming. It was as if his small body was being ripped apart from the inside. Sonia called Todd at work in a panic one afternoon, her voice trembling with fear. "Todd, something is wrong. This isn't normal. We need to take him back to the doctor," she said, holding back tears. Todd, feeling a wave of fear he hadn't known before, rushed home. They hurried back to the doctor, who this time could see that Colton's condition was critical. He advised them to take him to the hospital immediately. Todd and Sonia drove as fast as they could, their hearts pounding in their chests. Colton lay in the back seat, his face pale, eyes glazed over with pain. It was the longest drive of their lives, filled with silent prayers and a sense of dread they couldn't shake. When they arrived at the Great Plains Regional Medical Center, the emergency team took Colton in immediately. Tests revealed that his appendix had burst, something that the family doctor had missed during the initial examination. A ruptured appendix is a life-threatening emergency, especially for a small child. The toxins released into his body had already begun to spread, causing a severe infection. The doctors told Todd and Sonia that Colton's situation was critical. They needed to operate right away to have any chance of saving him. Sonia burst into tears, overwhelmed by the suddenness of it all. One moment, they were dealing with what seemed like a routine stomach bug. The next, they were being told their son's life was hanging by a thread. Todd tried to stay strong for his wife and daughter, but inside, he felt like he was crumbling. He wanted to scream, to beg God to spare his child, but he held back, knowing he had to keep it together for his family. He kissed Colton's forehead before they wheeled him into surgery. "I love you, buddy," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. Colton, barely conscious, managed a faint smile and said, "I love you too, Daddy." The surgery was intense and lasted much longer than expected. Todd paced the waiting room, unable to sit still. He tried to pray, but he couldn't find the words. Instead, he found himself silently pleading with God. Tears streaming down his face as he thought of all the moments he might lose with his son. The games they hadn't played yet, the questions Colton hadn't asked him yet, the dreams they had for his future. He had never felt so helpless. Meanwhile, Colton was undergoing a fight for his life in the operating room. His tiny body had already been weakened by the infection spreading through his abdomen. The surgical team worked frantically, trying to remove the toxins and stabilize him. At one point, his heart rate dropped dangerously low, and they feared they were losing him. It was a moment of sheer terror for the medical team, who fought desperately to keep him alive. As the surgery continued, something incredible happened. Colton, who appeared unconscious on the operating table, later described what he experienced during those critical moments. He claimed that he felt himself leave his body. It was as if he was suddenly floating above the operating table, looking down at the doctors working on him. He could see the frantic movements, the beads of sweat on the surgeon's forehead, and the intense focus on their faces. He watched, detached yet aware, as they struggled to save his life. At the same time, Colton said he could see his parents in the waiting room. He described his mother crying on the phone, speaking to family members, her voice filled with panic. He saw his father in a different corner of the room, pacing back and forth, his head bowed as he prayed. Colton later recounted how he could feel his father's fear and anguish, even though he was physically distant from him. It was an inexplicable experience for a child of 4 to describe with such clarity. When Colton awoke after the surgery, Todd and Sonia were relieved, though exhausted and still deeply worried. They sat by his side, holding his hands, whispering words of love and encouragement. But the relief was mixed with a lingering fear. The doctors couldn't guarantee that Colton was out of the woods. He had been through a life-threatening ordeal, and the risk of complications was still high. In the days following the surgery, as Colton regained his strength, he began to share his experience with his parents. It started innocently enough. He simply mentioned that he had watched them during the surgery. Todd and Sonia exchanged puzzled looks, not sure what he meant. How could he have seen them in the waiting room when he was under anesthesia, fighting for his life? When they pressed him for more details, they were shocked by what he described. Colton knew exactly where they had been standing, what they had been doing, and even snippets of their conversation. He spoke with the matter-of-fact innocence of a child, unaware that what he was saying was impossible. For Todd and Sonia, it was as if the ground had shifted beneath their feet. Their son had been near death, but he was describing events he couldn't possibly have seen or known about. They listened in stunned silence as Colton continued. He described being pulled upward, away from the hospital room, into a place filled with light. He said it felt warm and safe, like nothing he had ever experienced. "I went up to heaven," he said simply, looking at his parents with wide, sincere eyes. Colton's description of heaven began to spill out in bits and pieces over the following days. It wasn't something he sat down to tell as a complete story. Instead, it came up in the most unexpected ways, in the middle of conversations about seemingly ordinary things. Sonia and Todd were trying to navigate the shock and exhaustion of what they had just been through, still processing the reality that they nearly lost their son. They had prayed so hard, clinging to their faith, But hearing Colton talk about his experience felt like stepping into a new reality altogether. One day, while Colton was resting at home, he casually mentioned seeing a man in heaven. "I saw Pop," he said, with the innocent certainty only a child can have. Sonia's breath caught in her throat. "Pop?" she asked, unsure she had heard him correctly. "You mean my dad?" Colton nodded, smiling. "He was really happy to see me," he said. He started to describe the man he had met, the way he looked, his smile, and the warmth in his eyes. The description didn't match any recent photo of Sonia's father that Colton had ever seen. Instead, he described a younger version of the man, with dark hair and a strong build. Todd, listening intently, decided to show Colton an old family photo album. He flipped through it slowly, pointing out pictures of people he thought Colton might recognize. When he got to a faded black and white photo of Pop as a young man, Colton's eyes lit up. "That's him!" he exclaimed. "That's Pop!" Todd and Sonia exchanged a stunned look. Colton had never seen a picture of Pop as a young man. They had only ever shown him pictures from later in life, when he was older and had grey hair. The realization sent a shiver down Sonia's spine. She felt an overwhelming mixture of grief, disbelief, and a strange kind of comfort she couldn't quite put into words. As the days passed, Colton continued to talk about the things he had seen. His descriptions of heaven were simple, but profoundly detailed, filled with imagery that seemed both childlike and otherworldly. He spoke about vibrant colours, unlike anything he had seen before, describing a sky that seemed to glow without a sun. He talked about the music he heard, not just ordinary songs, but a kind of harmony that filled him with a sense of joy and peace beyond what he had ever felt on Earth. He said the light wasn't like the light we have here. It didn't come from one place, but seemed to shine from everything around him. One afternoon, while they were sitting together, Colton mentioned something that left his parents in silent shock. "I met my sister," he said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Todd and Sonia were puzzled. Cassie, Colton's older sister, was at school. They assumed that's who he was talking about. But Colton shook his head. "No, not Cassie," he explained. "I met my other sister." The room fell silent as his words sank in. Sonia's face went pale, and her eyes filled with tears. She knew instantly what Colton was saying, but it seemed impossible. How could he know? Years before Colton was born, Sonia had suffered a miscarriage. It was a painful experience, one she and Todd rarely spoke about, even to each other. They had never told Colton about it. He was too young to understand, and they didn't want to burden him with the sadness of that loss. Yet here he was, talking about a sister he had never been told existed. Sonia's hands trembled as she asked him gently, what did she look like? Colton's eyes lit up as he described her. "She had dark hair like yours, Mummy," he said. "And she was really, really happy. She hugged me and told me she couldn't wait for you to come to heaven someday." Sonia couldn't hold back her tears. She broke down sobbing, overwhelmed by the sudden wave of emotions. It was as if all the grief she had buried deep inside her heart was being unearthed at once. Todd pulled her into his arms, feeling his own tears welling up. They had mourned that loss quietly, privately, and here was their little boy speaking about it with such certainty, with details he couldn't possibly have known. It felt like a message from beyond. A small glimpse of a life they had lost, but was somehow still there, waiting for them. Colton didn't understand why his parents were crying. To him, it had been a happy reunion. "She said she's okay," he told them earnestly. "She's not sad. She loves you both so much." The words hit Sonia like a physical blow. It was the kind of reassurance she had longed for but never dared to hope for. She realized then that if what Colton was saying was true, it meant that their lost child wasn't really lost. She was safe, happy, and waiting for them in a place filled with love. The revelation changed something in Todd as well. He had been struggling with his own doubts, trying to reconcile his faith with the harsh realities of the world. He had spent countless hours as a pastor comforting others, assuring them of God's love and the promise of heaven. But secretly, he had carried his own fears and uncertainties. Hearing Colton talk about his sister, seeing the raw truth in his son's eyes, felt like a gift. It was a confirmation of everything he had preached, but never fully allowed himself to believe. It was as if God was speaking to him through Colton, giving him a glimpse of the divine plan, a reminder that even the smallest lives were part of something much greater. Over time, Colton's stories continued to unfold, each revelation more startling than the last. One day, while sitting on the couch with his father, he casually mentioned meeting a man who had told him how much he loved him. "He had big, strong hands," Colton said, "and he smiled a lot." Todd couldn't place who Colton might be talking about, so he asked for more details. Colton looked up, his eyes shining. "It was Jesus," he said simply. "He's really nice, Daddy. He loves everyone." Todd's heart skipped a beat. He had always taught his children about Jesus, but to hear his son speak of meeting him face to face was almost too much to comprehend. "What did Jesus look like?" Todd asked quietly, half afraid of what Colton might say. The boy paused, as if searching for the right words. "He had brown hair and a beard," he began. "And his eyes were like the ocean. They were full of love, like he knew everything about me, but still loved me anyway." Colton's description was simple, but profound. He talked about how Jesus wore a white robe with a purple sash, and that he had markers on his hands and feet. Todd felt a shiver run down his spine. He knew what Colton meant by markers: the scars from the crucifixion, the wounds from the nails. It was a detail that Colton couldn't have known, a piece of the story he was too young to fully understand. Yet he spoke about it with the confidence of someone who had seen it for himself. "What did Jesus say to you?" Todd asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Colton's expression turned serious, as if he was recalling something very important. "He told me it wasn't my time yet," he said. "He said I had to go back because he had work for me to do." The boy's voice was calm, but his words carried a weight that left Todd speechless. He pulled Colton into his arms, holding him close, as if he could protect him from the enormity of what he was saying. It felt like they were standing on sacred ground, teetering between the world they knew and something far beyond their comprehension. Sonia joined them, wrapping her arms around her husband and son. They sat there in silence, the three of them huddled together, trying to absorb the magnitude of what they were hearing. It was a moment that changed them forever. It was no longer just a story about a near-death experience. It was a message, a glimpse of heaven, and a reassurance that their faith was not in vain. For the Burpo family, it was the beginning of a new journey, one that would challenge their beliefs, deepen their faith, and set them on a path they never could have imagined. As Colton recovered, the Burpo family found themselves grappling with a flood of emotions. They were immensely grateful that Colton had survived, yet they were overwhelmed by the story he was telling them. It wasn't just the trauma of the emergency surgery and the close brush with death that left them shaken. It was the incredible, almost unbelievable details of what he described experiencing while unconscious. Todd and Sonia didn't know what to make of it. They had both grown up in the church, they had read the Bible countless times, and Todd had spent years preaching about heaven, the afterlife, and the love of Jesus. But hearing their son speak about meeting Jesus in heaven as if it were the most natural thing in the world, it left them stunned and searching for answers. In the weeks following Colton's release from the hospital, the story began to unfold piece by piece, often in the most casual moments. It wasn't as if Colton sat down to give a detailed account of everything he'd seen all at once. Instead, it emerged gradually, in snippets during breakfast, or while playing with his toys. One evening, as Todd was tucking Colton into bed, the little boy looked up at him with wide, innocent eyes. "Daddy," he said, "do you know how much Jesus loves the children?" Todd was caught off guard by the question, but he nodded. "Yes, buddy, I know," he replied. Colton's expression became even more serious. "No, Daddy," he insisted. "He really, really loves them. He told me." Colton spoke with the conviction of someone who had experienced a profound truth. He wasn't just repeating something he had been taught in Sunday school. It was as if he had come back with a message directly from Jesus, and he felt compelled to share it. Todd felt a wave of emotion he couldn't quite name. He had spent years preaching about Jesus' love, But it was different hearing it from his own child, who seemed to have been touched by that love in a way that went beyond words. It was both comforting and unsettling, a reminder of the divine mystery that they could only glimpse through the veil of faith. Sonia was still trying to process everything as well. She found herself watching Colton more closely, listening intently whenever he brought up his experience. There was no hesitation in his voice, no sense that he was making up a story or embellishing details. He spoke with the kind of honesty only a child can have, as if he were simply describing a trip to the park. One afternoon, while they were sitting together on the porch, Sonia asked him gently, "Colton, what else did you see in heaven?" Colton's face lit up with a smile. "I saw lots of animals," he said excitedly. "There were all kinds of horses, and they had really bright colours. Jesus had a rainbow horse, Mommy." Sonia couldn't help but smile at the image of Jesus riding a rainbow-coloured horse. It was such a childlike detail, so full of wonder and imagination, yet there was something about the way Colton said it that made her pause. He wasn't just talking about a dream or a fantasy, he was describing it as if he had seen it with his own eyes. As Colton's parents began to share his story with a few close friends, word started to spread. People in their church community were both fascinated and moved by what Colton was saying. Many of them had experienced loss or were struggling with doubts about their faith, and Colton's account of heaven gave them a sense of comfort and hope they hadn't felt in years. The idea that a young child, untouched by the cynicism of adulthood, had seen a glimpse of the afterlife and come back with a message of love and reassurance resonated deeply. But not everyone was ready to accept the story. Skepticism soon crept in, even among people who had known the Burpos for years. Some of Todd's fellow pastors listened politely, but seemed uncomfortable, as if they were trying to reconcile what Colton was saying with their own understanding of theology. Others suggested that perhaps it was just a vivid dream brought on by the anesthesia or a child's way of processing the trauma he had been through. One friend even hinted that it might be Colton's imagination running wild after hearing so many Bible stories. Todd struggled with these reactions. He understood the doubts. He had wrestled with his own skepticism at first, but he also knew his son. He knew the difference between a child making up a fanciful story and a child speaking from a place of deep, inexplicable truth. He couldn't dismiss what Colton was saying, even if part of him wanted to. It wasn't just the details that were striking. It was the way Colton's entire demeanour had changed. He seemed older, wiser in a way that went beyond his years. There was a calmness about him, a quiet certainty that Todd had never seen before. Eventually, Todd and Sonia realized they needed to share Colton's story more broadly. It wasn't about seeking attention or trying to convince anyone. It was about spreading the message that had been given to their son. They decided to write a book, though it was a daunting task. Todd had always been comfortable speaking in front of a congregation, but putting his family's most personal experiences into words for the world to see felt different. It required a level of vulnerability he hadn't expected. Still, they felt a deep sense of responsibility. They believed that Colton had been given this experience for a reason, and it was their duty to help him share it. The process of writing was both cathartic and challenging. As Todd and Sonia went through each part of the story, they found themselves reliving the trauma of nearly losing their son, as well as the incredible moments of revelation that followed. They laughed, they cried, and they prayed together as they pieced together the narrative. Colton, now a little older, was eager to help. He sat with his parents, offering corrections and adding details as they wrote. "No, Daddy," he would say, shaking his head. "It wasn't like that. It was brighter. There was more light." When the book, titled Heaven is for Real, was finally published, the response was overwhelming. It quickly became a bestseller, resonating with readers across the country and beyond. People from all walks of life, devout Christians, agnostics, even those who had long given up on the idea of an afterlife, found themselves moved by the story. The simplicity of Colton's descriptions, the childlike wonder in his words, made it hard for people to dismiss. It wasn't a complex theological argument. It was a pure, unfiltered account from a little boy who said he had been to heaven and met Jesus. As the book's popularity grew, the Burpo family was invited to speak at churches, conferences, and community events. Colton, still just a young child, found himself standing in front of hundreds, sometimes thousands of people, recounting his experience. He didn't seem nervous. Instead, he spoke with a quiet confidence that left audiences in awe. He would describe the colors, the animals, the angels singing, and the overwhelming sense of love he felt. People listened with tears streaming down their faces, some whispering prayers of thanks, others holding on to every word as if it were a lifeline. Not everyone believed, of course. There were skeptics at every event, people who came to challenge the story or dismiss it as a child's fantasy. But Colton didn't argue or try to convince them. He simply told his story, leaving it up to the listener to decide what to believe. Todd watched his son with a mixture of pride and amazement. Here was his little boy who had once clung to him in fear, now standing before strangers, sharing a message of hope and love that seemed to come from a place far beyond his own understanding. For many, hearing Colton speak was a transformative experience. People who had lost loved ones found comfort in his words, taking them as a sign that their departed were at peace in a place filled with light and love. It was as if a door had been opened, offering a glimpse into a world that most only dream of. Colton's simple, heartfelt testimony touched something deep within them, a universal longing for reassurance that death was not the end, but rather a continuation into a life more beautiful than they could imagine. As the events continued, the Burpos realized that their lives had been changed forever. They were no longer just a small-town family from Nebraska. They had become messengers of a story that seemed to transcend time and space. A story that carried with it a message of hope, faith, and the promise of something greater beyond this earthly life. The response to Colton's story grew exponentially after the publication of the book and the subsequent media coverage. What had started as a deeply personal, private family experience had become a phenomenon, capturing the attention of millions. For Todd and Sonia, it was a double-edged sword. On one hand, they were grateful for the overwhelming support and the many letters they received from people who had found solace in Colton's account. On the other hand, they found themselves facing a wave of skepticism and criticism that they hadn't fully anticipated. In the beginning, it was mostly friends and neighbors who reached out, offering words of encouragement. People from their church community shared how Colton's story had renewed their faith or helped them through a period of grief. One woman, who had recently lost her husband, told Sonia through tears that she finally felt at peace knowing that he might be in a place filled with light and love, as Colton had described. "I've been praying for a sign," she said softly, clutching the book to her chest. "Your son's words were exactly what I needed." But as the story spread beyond their small town, the reaction became more complicated. National media outlets picked up the story, featuring the Burpo family in interviews on major television networks. They were invited onto talk shows, where Todd and Sonia found themselves retelling the story again and again. Colton, still so young, sat beside his parents, quietly listening, chiming in when asked about specific details. He answered questions with the same innocent certainty, his eyes wide with sincerity as he spoke about Jesus and the angels. Yet, the more public the story became, the more it seemed to attract scrutiny. Skeptics began to voice their doubts, particularly in online forums and social media platforms. They questioned the authenticity of Colton's experience, suggesting that it could have been influenced by his upbringing in a devout Christian household. Of course he saw Jesus, some critics argued. That's all he's been taught since birth. It's just a child's imagination combined with the trauma of surgery. Others pointed to scientific explanations, citing studies on near-death experiences and the effects of anesthesia on the brain. They argued that Colton's visions could be attributed to hallucinations brought on by oxygen deprivation, rather than a genuine glimpse of the afterlife. Todd, who had spent years as a pastor preaching about the power of faith, found himself grappling with a new kind of challenge. He wasn't used to this level of public scrutiny. In his sermons, he had always emphasized the importance of personal testimony, the idea that each person's experience with God was unique and valid. But now, faced with a barrage of criticism from people who had never met his family, He struggled to find the right words. He felt a deep sense of protectiveness over Colton, who had shared his story with such innocence and trust, only to have it dissected and questioned by strangers. Sonia, too, felt the weight of the criticism. She had always been the more private of the two, less comfortable with the spotlight. In the quiet moments when it was just her and Todd, she confessed her fears. "What if people think we're making this up?" she would whisper, her voice filled with anxiety. "What if they think we're just trying to get attention?" Todd would hold her close, trying to reassure her, but he couldn't deny the knot of worry in his own chest. He had never intended for their story to become a spectacle. They had simply wanted to share the message they believed had been given to their son, a message of love, hope, and the reality of heaven. The skepticism wasn't limited to online forums. At public events, Todd began to notice a shift in the questions people asked. While many still approached with tears in their eyes, thanking them for sharing their story, others were more pointed, even confrontational. One man, at a book signing event, asked bluntly, "Don't you think it's possible that your son's visions were just a dream? Or that he's saying what you want to hear?" Todd was taken aback, but he tried to respond calmly. "I know my son," he said simply. "I've seen the way his eyes light up when he talks about what he saw. It's not something he learned from us. It's something he experienced." Despite Todd's attempts to address the skepticism with grace, the criticisms persisted. Some accused the family of exploiting Colton's story for financial gain, especially after the book became a bestseller. The publication had brought in more money than the Burpos had ever seen before, allowing them to pay off medical bills and make necessary repairs to their home. But the accusations stung. Todd had always prided himself on living a humble, honest life. The idea that people thought they were using their son's experience for profit cut him deeply. In the midst of the backlash, Colton remained largely unaware of the controversies swirling around him. He was still just a child, after all, more interested in playing with his friends and exploring the world around him than in debates about the afterlife. His innocence was a source of comfort to his parents, a reminder of why they had decided to share his story in the first place. He continued to speak about his experience with the same quiet certainty, unaffected by the opinions of strangers. For Colton, it wasn't a matter of belief or disbelief. It was simply what he had seen. One day, after a particularly difficult interview where the host had pressed Todd on the scientific explanations for near-death experiences, he returned home feeling exhausted and defeated. He found Colton in the backyard, playing with a toy truck. The sight of his son, so carefree and unburdened, brought tears to Todd's eyes. He walked over and knelt down beside him, pulling him into a tight hug. "I'm proud of you, buddy," he whispered. "You've been so brave." Colton looked up at his father, puzzled by the sudden show of emotion. "Why are you crying, Daddy?" he asked. Todd shook his head, wiping his eyes. "It's just, sometimes people don't understand," he said. "But that's okay, we know the truth, don't we?" Colton nodded, his expression serious. "Yeah, Daddy," he said. "Jesus told me it's real. Heaven is real." The simplicity of his words cut through all of Todd's doubts and fears. In that moment, he realized that it didn't matter what other people thought. The skeptics could question, the critics could doubt, but it wouldn't change what Colton had seen and felt. It wouldn't change the peace that his story had brought to so many people who were struggling to hold on to their faith. As time went on, Todd and Sonia learned to navigate the mixed reactions with more ease. They stopped trying to convince everyone of the truth of Colton's experience and instead focused on sharing the message of hope that had come from it. They realized that their job wasn't to provide proof. It was simply to share their story and let people take from it what they needed. Some would find comfort, some would find doubt, and that was okay. Their role was to be the messengers, not the judges. The letters continued to pour in, many of them from parents who had lost children, thanking the Burpos for giving them a reason to believe that their little ones were safe and happy in heaven. Sonia kept a special box filled with these letters, reading them on the days when the criticism felt too heavy to bear. Each note was a reminder of the impact Colton's story was having, far beyond what they could see or measure. It was a testament to the power of a simple message told by a child, that there is something beyond this life, a place filled with light and love, where we are all held in the embrace of something greater than ourselves. For Todd, the experience became a lesson in humility and faith. He had started out wanting to defend his son's story against the skeptics, to prove its truth beyond a shadow of a doubt. But he realized that wasn't his role. He didn't need to fight every battle or convince every doubter. All he needed to do was keep sharing the story, trusting that it would reach the people who needed to hear it. He had always believed in the power of testimony, but now he understood it in a deeper way. It wasn't about being right. It was about offering hope. As the initial wave of skepticism began to die down, the Burpo family found a new sense of peace. They had weathered the storm of criticism and come out stronger on the other side. They knew there would always be people who doubted, just as there would always be people who believed. In the end, it didn't matter. What mattered was the story itself, the message that had been given to a little boy, and the lives it had touched along the way. The Burpo family was both relieved and exhausted as the initial rush of attention began to wane. The whirlwind of interviews, book signings, and speaking engagements had taken a toll on them, and they longed for the quiet simplicity of their life before Colton's extraordinary experience became public knowledge. Yet, despite the challenges, they felt a renewed sense of purpose. They understood that sharing Colton's story had become a part of their lives now. A mission they hadn't anticipated, but had accepted with open hearts. As Colton grew, he became more articulate about his experience. He could explain his vision of heaven with even greater detail, filling in gaps and painting a vivid picture for those who listened. He described it as a place of overwhelming peace and beauty, far beyond what any words could capture. He said that everything in heaven seemed to be filled with light, not just illuminated by a sun, but glowing with an internal radiance that was almost musical in its harmony. He spoke of the flowers that never wilted, the trees that sang softly in the breeze, and the angels whose voices blended into a celestial chorus. It was a vision so bright and full of love that it brought comfort to countless people who heard him speak. As he continued to share his story publicly, the invitations only increased. Todd and Sonia had to make careful decisions about which events to attend, trying to balance the demands of their newfound role as storytellers with their responsibilities at home. Colton, who had once been a shy little boy, seemed to transform when he spoke about heaven. He stood in front of large crowds without a hint of fear, his voice steady and clear. He didn't use complicated language or grand gestures. Instead, he spoke with a simple honesty that disarmed even the most hardened skeptics. It was as if he were just chatting with a friend, recounting something he had seen on a school field trip. One of the most remarkable aspects of Colton's story was how it touched people across different faiths and backgrounds. The message he brought back wasn't wrapped in doctrine or theological debate. It was a message of universal love and the promise of a better place. At one event, a woman approached the family in tears, explaining that she had lost her son to a tragic accident the year before. "I've been so angry at God," she confessed. "I couldn't understand why he would take my boy away. But hearing Colton speak today, it feels like a small piece of my heart has been healed. I believe now that my son is safe and happy, just like Colton described." The woman's words left Todd speechless. He had seen many people respond emotionally to Colton's story, but each time it happened, it felt like a miracle. It was a reminder that they were part of something much larger than themselves. A story that had the power to reach into the deepest corners of human grief and offer a sliver of hope. Todd realized that this was the true gift they had been given. Not just the miracle of Colton's survival, but the chance to bring comfort to others in their darkest moments. Despite the positive impact, the skepticism never completely disappeared. In fact, it seemed to grow more sophisticated as the years went by. Colton's story became the subject of heated debates on radio shows, podcasts, and online forums. Critics dissected every detail, some accusing the family of fabricating the entire experience for fame and fortune. There were entire articles written about the psychological effects of near-death experiences, proposing complex neurological explanations for Colton's visions. They pointed to studies that suggested the brain, when deprived of oxygen, could produce vivid hallucinations that felt incredibly real to the person experiencing them. Sonia found these criticisms particularly difficult to handle. She was a mother, first and foremost, and her instinct was to protect her son from anything that might hurt him. She worried about how all this scrutiny might affect Colton as he got older. Would he start to doubt his own experience? Would he feel pressured to defend himself against the accusations of people who had never met him? In her quiet moments, she prayed for strength, asking God to guide them through this confusing, often painful journey. Colton, however, seemed unaffected by the noise of the outside world. He continued to live his life with the same childlike wonder he had always had, even as he grew into a teenager. He played sports, hung out with his friends, and loved spending time with his family. The story of his visit to heaven was a part of him, but it didn't define him entirely. He didn't walk around proclaiming it to everyone he met. Instead, he shared it when asked, with the same simple honesty he had shown as a little boy. It was a part of his life, but it wasn't the whole of it. As the years passed, the Burpo family began to settle back into a new kind of normal. They still received letters and invitations, but they learned to say no when they needed to, focusing on the life they had built together. Todd returned to his duties at the church, and Sonia continued her work with the local school. They found joy in the small, everyday moments: family dinners, movie nights, and trips to the lake. It was in these quiet, ordinary times that they felt the most grateful, a reminder of the miracle they had been given. One summer evening, as the sun set over their backyard, Todd and Colton sat together, watching the sky turn shades of pink and orange. "Do you remember everything you saw in heaven?" Todd asked quietly, not wanting to push but curious if the memories had faded with time. Colton nodded, his eyes far away, as if he were looking back into a distant, beautiful place. "I remember," he said softly. "I remember the light, and how everything felt so warm and safe. And I remember Jesus." He looked at his father and smiled. "He was so kind, Daddy. He loved me so much." Todd felt a lump form in his throat. He had heard Colton say these words 100 times, but it still moved him, still filled him with a sense of awe. He realized then that Colton's story had never been about proving anything to anyone. It was about the love that his son had experienced, a love so pure and complete that it had left an indelible mark on him. It was about a child's simple, unshakable faith in the face of the most profound mysteries of life and death. For the Burpos, the journey was not about convincing the world that heaven existed. It was about sharing the gift they had been given, the small glimpse of something greater. It was about offering a message of hope to a world that so often felt dark and uncertain. They had learned that they couldn't control how people received their story. Some would believe, some would doubt, and that was okay. Their job was simply to be faithful to the message, to trust that it would find its way to those who needed it most. As they sat together, watching the last of the sunlight fade into the horizon, Todd put his arm around his son. They sat in silence, the kind of comfortable silence that only comes from a deep, unspoken understanding. They didn't need words to express what they were feeling. They both knew that they were part of something extraordinary, something that went beyond the limits of human understanding. And they knew that no matter what the future held, they would continue to share their story, one person at a time, trusting that the light Colton had seen in heaven was still shining, guiding them forward. In the end, that was all they needed: faith, love, and the unshakable belief that heaven is real.
Thank you for watching. If this story touched your heart, inspired you, or gave you a deeper sense of hope, consider subscribing to this channel. By doing so, you'll join a community of faith, encouragement, and shared stories. Remember, God sees your steps of faith, and as you seek Him, His blessings and guidance will abound in your life. Hit the subscribe button, like this video, and share it with others who need to hear this message. Together, let's spread His light and love to the world. God bless you.